Good morning. I hope everyone's having a great new year. With the upcoming medical school admission cycle in full swing for the people who are applying, I've been answering a lot of questions about the MCAT and also being sort of re-exposed in that annual way to the slew of misconceptions that exist surrounding not only this exam but standardized testing and actually education in general. And so I felt compelled to create this video, and I'm going to talk about basically the the points of discussion that I bring up with all of my new clients, all of my new um, uh, students, and more actually with patients, depending on who they are. So, what's the problem in the first place with the common knowledge? In my experience, it tends to be based upon extremism. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, you have people who do absolutely nothing right. They don't employ even somewhat valid study strategies. They have all sorts of things going on personally, and then they go take the exam. It's a very crushing experience because there's not a lot of metacognition going on in analyzing why the results are the way that they are. And so those stories get out and they potentiate a lot of anxiety among people, and I was one of them. On the other hand, you have people who are very, very talented, and I'm not putting either party at fault here. They're very, very talented. And so when people ask them for advice, they say, well, what did you do to study? Well, I just memorized this entire book. And so there's an air of neuroticism, and then the examples that are being put out are very perhaps inaccessible to most people without changing fundamental things about who they are and how they live and how they enjoy learning. And so the issue here is not only that that you have this extremity, but also the strategies that are commonly employed are completely oblivious to learning principles. There are certain neuroscientific and psychological principles which really underpin the way that everybody learns if you're human and you have a human brain. And the other issue is there is no integration of standardized exam prep with personal goals, health, well-being, other obligations, and that is an even greater issue for people who are not in the sort of more common boat of just go to school, study, sleep, wake up. People who have to work, take care of families, or really anyone who has anything going on outside of school. A lot of the methods that are commonly championed just aren't very accessible, as I said. So let's talk about the first myth. And this myth is actually surrounding both the MCAT and the USMLE, the board exams that come up later in your career if you choose to go to medical school. And to a lesser extent also the I can't remember the name of them, the NCLEX that nurses take for their certification. So a lot of MCAT students come to me and I say, all right, what's your plan? How are you going to prep? And they say, well, phase 1 is I'm going to read all the books, I'm going to get all the content, and then phase 2 is I'm going to study. The assumption there is that, or practice, and the assumption that they're making is that the MCAT is a content exam, just like a syllabus-based exam in undergraduate. You memorize the things, and if you can regurgitate 70% of them, you pass. But that's not really how the MCAT works. Now, if you go on the AAMC's website, you'll find an entire list of content. It says these are the content areas that are going to be tested. But it's important to think of MCAT content less of, don't think of it like a syllabus, think of it like a list of vocabulary. For example, if I were to give you 10 words right now, and I say remember these words and their definitions, and then I were to ask you about them in 2 weeks, you probably wouldn't remember more than 1 or 2 of them, and those 2 because you're already familiar with them in some way. On the other hand, if I give you 3 words right now, I give you the definition, I give you a story surrounding them, and if I say, okay, use that word in a sentence with me, and then I come back in 3 days, you'll probably be able to remember all 3 of them, even if I taught you another 3 tomorrow and another 3 the day after that. When it comes to the MCAT, the majority of your points are going to be gained from analyzing a passage and answering questions. They're multiple choice questions, and that's always sort of looked down upon as a cop-out by educators. It often is. But in this case, it's trying to teach you a process that you may have heard of called differential diagnosis. So it's not just about, I see this, I know that the answer is A. It's I see this, and because of this aspect and this aspect, it's probably not C, and it's probably not D because of this, this, and this, and A, if A is true, then C is also true, and if C is untrue, A is also untrue, so the answer is B. So a lot of the time, the way that you are supposed to answer the question is not actually by knowing it. It's not actually by knowing it. It is by either learning it in context of passages and questions, reasoning out what must be true, or by having enough background familiarity that you can gestalt 3 of the answers into falsehood. So that being the case, it's just not very useful to go and memorize a whole fund of things. And we'll talk about exactly how to prep in a minute, but I wanted to just put that out off the bat because so many people exclusively study content and they do terribly on the exam, and it's, that's a lot of the sort of, I've taken it once, now I'm going to take Kaplan, and I meet with these students, and that's usually what I hear. There is another issue surrounding this, is the resources that get shared. Resources, people are always asking me about resources. And invariably, the resources they're talking about are lists of information. Now, is there a difference between using Kaplan's review notes, list of information, or some PDF or another that's circulating, or that one Reddit page, or Khan Academy, or whatever? No, not at all. Now, you might have a greater affinity for a list form of notes. Other people might have a greater affinity for Kaplan's materials because they're very concise. Other people might like Princeton Review's materials because they're a lot more lengthy, or Khan Academy because they go a lot more in depth. That depends on you. If anyone tells you that one set list of MCAT information is superior to another, unless there's something subtle, like for example, I tend to advise students not to go for exhaustive information, very long books, and there are many companies that make very long books because it's too overwhelming and it's not really the scope you need. But unless someone has a specific reason like that for saying X is better than Y, X and Y are equivocal. You just have to decide what you like better. More to the point, whichever one you choose doesn't matter. Just don't switch between them, because when you switch between them, you have to adapt to the nuances in the different ways things are presented and reconcile them and that type of thing. And that wastes a lot of time and tends to cause a lot of stress. Okay, so that's talking about that knowledge myth. So I will tell you sort of the key techniques for prep, but to start with, let's talk about the 2 principles that underpin successful MCAT prep. These are the principles that education specialists use to design medical school curriculums, but it's also the underpinning of Princeton Review, Kaplan, everyone, that when we put together curricula for standardized exam prep, this is what we're trying to maximize. So number 1, state-based learning. To conceptualize this, please think about 2 white belts, okay? Taekwondo white belts they're planning to fight each other in 2 weeks. Person A goes and he gets a bunch of books and he reads all about fighting, and he knows the exact angle that you're supposed to have your kick and your stance and where you have your hands and exactly what to do when someone throws a right hook or a left hook or a jab or a cross or an uppercut or whatever. He knows all of these things by the time of the fight, but he's never practiced. Let's take person 2. If you said to person 2 or person B, I can't remember if we're using letters or numbers for this metaphor, This person doesn't read anything. He goes to the studio every day and he practices for an hour a day in the ring. And he gets knocked out a bunch of times, he get knocked down a bunch of times, makes a bunch of mistakes, learns from them, learns some techniques in practice. Now, if I asked him, what angle are you supposed to have your feet relative to one another when you're fighting? He would not know. He wouldn't be able to describe that. But who do you think is going to win in that fight those 2 weeks later? Probably the guy who is practicing. That's what state-based learning means. Now, applying that to your education, in undergraduate school, you see that people have exams at 10 a.m. in a quiet room. They're an hour long. How do people study for that? Usually at about 11:30 p.m. in their mom's basement while listening to Metallica and the cats running around distracting them. So, yes, you did look over the notes. You did look over the syllabus and all the PowerPoints, but you're still not scoring as well as you could on those exams. Why? Because your practice is not representative of the thing you're practicing for. Even in 5th grade, you remember if anyone was in band or orchestra or something, you practice before the performance. Maybe the band director will take you on the stage and you practice on the stage. You actually do the act that you're going to perform. And that's the same with the MCAT. A successful schedule of prep involves iterative practice events, analysis and review based on those practice events, and then repetition of representative practice events leading up to test day. It does not involve sitting and reading books about the thing you're trying to do without practicing the thing, which is probably the most common way in which people throw away the opportunity for a great score and a positive, painless result. The second principle is called the spacing effect. The spacing effect is fairly simple to understand, and it has two components. Number one, as the number of repetitions increases, retention increases. Number two, as the distance between repetitions increases, the retention increases as well. So, for example, I did a bad job of explaining that. Let's say that I prepare for a marathon by running 4 hours on Saturday. So on Saturday, I run 4 hours, and the marathon is in a month. So I run those 4 hours, and then I don't do anything else until the marathon. Now already you're probably thinking I'm not going to do very well. So contrast that, what if I do 1 hour of running every week for the 4 weeks leading up to the marathon? Just based on our overall, heuristic understanding of how to prepare for things, you should probably be thinking that 1 hour a week is way better than 4 hours once. Even better than that is going to be 20 minutes a day, 3 times a week, every week in those 4 weeks leading up to the marathon. That's the spacing effect. In terms of knowledge acquisition, preparing for academic things, it means that rather than having Saturday be your study day, and it's 4 hours of study, it's rigorous, it's boring, it's frustrating, you do half an hour a day, an hour a day. Maybe be ambitious, 3-4 hours a day if you can really, put that together. But that is also commonly not what people do. And I hear all kinds of excuses. Well, I'm working, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. The hard fact of the matter is whatever other circumstances you have, if you can find a consistent period of study, you should, and you almost always can. That's going to be better for you than trying to get a big block of study that makes you feel like you actually did something substantial. You might feel like you're doing better, but you're really not. 20 minutes a day is way better than 2 hours once a week, period. Scientifically, with neuroscientific underpinnings, it is just better. So with those things in mind and my sloppy explanation of the spacing effect, let's talk about how to prep. And we'll talk about integrating those two principles with your prep schedule too. Now, I usually like to start with positives, but there are so many layers of misinformation I have to strip down today that I'm going to start with a couple of negative things to do, meaning removal rather than addition. Number one is avoidance of lists. Avoid lists. Do not spend valuable study time reading cover to cover through Kaplan's exam notes. Don't spend valuable study time reading through an entire PDF compilation of everything you need to know for the MCAT. It's not an efficient way to spend your time. And the other thing that I find with people who do that is, they present to me with, chronic anxiety. Say, I studied, but there was so much more, and then I, doing the kinematic equations, but I didn't understand this thing on page 470 billion of this PDF, and it becomes so overwhelming that you become discouraged. And I see that all the time. Half my job is just to sit here and be a therapist for people who have, buried themselves in anxiety because they chose to go through these lists of information. The fact of the matter is, you could do a PhD on a single passage. A lot of the time you're reading passages in the MCAT that are adapted from academic papers. Some of these papers obviously must have taken people years and years, a full PhD, a full fellowship, a full, the full consequence of a grant being, spent to completion and published. Honestly, just think about that for a second. Are you really going to be able to learn everything that could be presented to you on the MCAT? Absolutely not. 0% chance. 0% chance. Because they rewrite it every year with new science. So if you learn every piece of information that was even slightly alluded to in the 2016 MCAT, by the time you've learned all of that to a level of mastery, we'll be in like 2020 and they're using a whole new set of science. So don't start by trying to exhaust a list and think that you've learned everything about the MCAT. You've done nothing but waste time. Take the list, put it to the side, and use that. Consult it as you study the right way, and we'll talk about that. Now, step 2, avoid neuroticism. The second most common thing that I have to dispel with my new students is, I was talking to my friend the other day, and he said that he was studying 18 hours a day and that his score jumped from a 472 to a 510 in one administration. And stop talking to people. I'm not encouraging you to become a social hermit, but at least for your MCAT prep, if you're going, and I used to think this was, I was an undergraduate at UT Dallas. I thought this was a UT Dallas phenomenon. It's not. It's actually way, way worse at many other places. People really drive themselves up the wall. People are using false information, they're using faulty study methods, and they're bringing a lot of their personal things into it. You see someone who's panicking over this exam, and what you don't see is that they have a sick relative, that they have a medical condition, that they have a financial problem, and those things are all culminating to get or combining to give them a lot of anxiety. You ask them about the MCAT, you hear back a lot of anxiety, you become anxious. It's very, very important. And there is training that you undergo in medical school and beyond, honestly, experientially, which enables you to deal with a lot of misinformation, a lot of neuroticism, a lot of anxiety, and not let it affect you. But it takes years and years of practice, and even then it is hard. So, not that you cannot do it, all of you will be able to do that. But perhaps it's not the best time to practice when you yourself are very anxious, dealing with a lot of uncertainty. Reasonably so. There's the application process, writing all this stuff. There's a lot of black boxes that are influencing where you want to go. And that's a very anxious place to be. And so talking to people who are also in that place in a way that is undisciplined, it causes a lot of anxiety. If you're going to talk to people about your prep, keep it positive, keep it short, and be disciplined. If someone is saying something to you that's making you anxious, you need to say, I can't hear that right now. I love you, you're my friend, but I cannot hear that right now. Or replace it with something better. Say, if someone comes to you and says, well, I just finished moving my way through all of these books, say, well, Good for you. That's great. Have you thought about practice? Have you thought about state-based learning? Have you thought about the spacing effect? You can help them. Helping them will probably diminish your anxiety, and it'll probably be beneficial to them too. But don't let that anxiety resonate with you, and don't let it negatively impact your prep. That is one of the most common reasons I see people go to pieces during this process. Okay, let's talk about the actual study modality itself, which is a practice-based modality. So what we do, and if you've taken Kaplan, you know this, you start with a diagnostic test, and that is the basis for all of your prep. Ideally, your prep will be taking a diagnostic test, whether it's a full length. You can purchase them a la carte from Exam Crackers. I haven't used those, to be honest. You can purchase for $242 a full suite of full-length tests and practice question banks from the AAMC. These are the best materials I usually advise my students to save for the last month or two of their prep, probably 2 months. Or if you're going to go with a company, go with a company. I'm partial to Kaplan. I have extensively used both materials as an instructor, Kaplan and Princeton, that second set really through my students. I'm partial to Kaplan. The user interface is a lot friendlier in my opinion. I also find that Kaplan does a better job of keeping it to scope, meaning the information isn't too overwhelming or deeper than it needs to be. That's why I advocate for those materials, and I don't get any kickback for that. It's just honestly what I would advise, and it is what I used as well. Now, once you have a set of materials, by the way, Princeton and Kaplan both come with the AAMC, so if you purchase one of those, you already have the AAMC. Once you have a set of materials, we need to stick with those materials. So if you're using Exam Crackers and you start with full length 1, you're going to go through all of those practice tests, and then you'll buy the AAMC materials and go through those. That might be the cheapest method. If you have Princeton or Kaplan, you're going to start with test 1, and we're going to move through those. We're not going to jump back and forth between materials because that creates anomalies as you adjust from a nuanced set of literary techniques, compositional quirks. You don't want to have that, that confounding variable. Okay, so you've taken a practice test. What do? You go through every single question and you articulate what was the process that enabled me to answer it correctly, or what were the key errors that led to my answering this incorrectly. Kaplan calls it a why I missed it sheet. So you have a big sheet of paper or an Excel. One of my students currently is using Excel. A lot of students do that actually. And so you have this list now. You go through every question. You know what you did right. You know what you did wrong. And more importantly, if you look at question 57 or 53 or whatever and you got it wrong, you have articulated, I got this wrong because I have never heard of the Lensmaker equation. Maybe question 55, on the other hand, you go into that and you knew everything. You totally got it. You used the right equation. But you forgot that this particular logarithmic rule works this way. You made a little math error, or you had an error of understanding. You confused kinetic control with thermodynamic control, for example. You knew both of them, but you switched them around. Now, what that enables you to do is for that question where you did not know how to address this at all, that question might indicate you're going to look at your study schedule for the next week, and you're going to put aside 30 minutes a day to address that. Very, very important. You will not learn a new thing in one sitting. I don't care if that sitting is 1 hour or 9 hours. Do not attempt to do that. Because what ends up happening is you kind of get it, you get frustrated, you try practice with, you still don't get it, you go to lunch, come back, you bang your head against it a while. Now all you've done is develop a complex about that thing. What you should do instead is, let's say I'm going to watch the Khan Academy video on the Lensmaker equation on Monday, and I'm going to do the associated questions with it on Khan Academy. And I'll review the questions too. Maybe that all will take 45 minutes to an hour. On Tuesday, I'm going to revisit it, but I'm going to go into my, let's say, Kaplan QBank, and I'm going to do 5 questions. I'm going to review them, and I'm going to see, I'm going to make sure that I can articulate what each of the terms mean and why it's relevant. Then maybe on Wednesday you're going to do another question bank, this time 10 questions to sort of, continue reinforcing it. And maybe those are going to be from a physics textbook and they'll be more in depth. And what you'll notice is if you continue like that, in that vein, sort of just using each day's practice to inform the next, by Friday you'll have a pretty solid grasp of it. Now, you might not see that again for another week or two. And when you see it, you might get it wrong. But the spacing effect, right? So you'll see it again, you might get it wrong. And then it won't be, I need to start from the Khan Academy video. It'll be, I'm just going to check my notes, check, 5-10 questions. All right, I get it. And you'll see it again as you move through other practice questions, and that'll keep it fresh enough in your mind that you'll be able to answer the questions on that right on test day. So, on the other hand, you had that question where you pretty much knew what was going on. And so for that one, you probably go into your notes, whether it's the PDF, whether it's the Princeton book, Kaplan book, whatever, and you look it over and like, oh, okay, I switched those two definitions. Do 5 or 10 questions, do another 5 or 10 on Tuesday, another 5 or 10 on Wednesday, so on and so forth, and you'll probably be fine by the end of the week. And again, you'll see it iteratively. I'm sorry, my cat seems to be making some noise. Okay. And that is the gist of how you're going to structure your prep. So there is no content phase, practice phase. There's only practice, and you're iteratively moving through practice, and as you do that, you're gaining content. By test day, you've got enough content just by doing that. More powerfully, you actually will know by doing that how to use all that content. It won't just be there and waiting to be practiced, you're not sure how to apply it. You will actually know how to use all of that content. It's beautiful. And I find that when you're using that type of modality, you're feeling that improvement. When you study something, you don't know if you got it the right way. You just you went over it. This is giving you constant affirmation that you're doing it right. And when you're doing it wrong, it's telling you, it's like, okay, you got the question based on this wrong, therefore you need to brush up. So that's the gist of the study modality. Now, what we didn't mention so much in the study modality is the state-based learning. So to do this, there's a couple things you're going to do. Number one, whenever you're taking questions, do it without no research. Don't look it up on Google. Don't have a book next to you. Don't work through it like you would in class. Answer the question in an isolated way. It's you and the question. There is no help. You're doing your best. If you get it wrong, you get it wrong. That's fine, because that will at least enable you to diagnose your strategy, your thought process, and your content, and the integration of all those things. Whereas if you look it up, you might convince yourself, yeah, I know how to do it, but that's not representative. That's you reading the book about boxing and then getting into the ring, getting knocked out. So make sure you're actually in the ring. Also, when you're taking full-length exams, you sleep the night before, the time that you would sleep before test day. You wake up the morning of the time that you plan to wake up on test day. So if you live in Plano, Texas, and your test is in Dallas, and it's a 45-minute drive, test is at 8 a.m., you might be leaving your house at 5:50 or 6 to get there 45 minutes, half an hour in advance. Depends on traffic and that type of stuff. So make sure that you're practicing that, because you don't want to be groggy the morning of the test. The breaks you take, they should be representative of the breaks you have on the MCAT. Make sure you're not taking excessively long, leisurely breaks, and make sure that you're not accessing things that you wouldn't be able to access during the breaks, i.e. study materials, phones, YouTube, calling your mom. Don't do any of that. It's just you and the test. Go to the bathroom, do some stretching, maybe a bit of light calisthenics in the hall. That's the type of thing you do during the breaks. And so the breaks are also an opportunity for you to figure out what's that little ritualistic thing you do to get yourself back in the zone for the next section. That can be very useful. Okay. State-based learning, spacing effect, how to study, what materials to use, what not to do. Okay, now, the most important dimension of prep. There is a prevailing culture of being very neglectful towards ourselves. And this is not to make anyone feel bad or lesser or to feel superior myself or anything, because I have been a victim of this myself. I've grappled with this myself. We have to be okay feeling okay. So I will give you an example. I once had a student who was living in a difficult scenario. So, she had very noisy roommates, and it was very it was not at all amenable to prep. And so we spoke about it, and she decided that she's going to move out. She moves out, and her practice test score jumped by about 12 points in one administration because she was able to sleep through the night. Now, that's an extreme example. I'm sorry, my throat's getting a bit dry. But it's very common that it's so common that I've actually made it an established practice of my first session that I do a sort of sorry. I screen health behaviors during the first session, and that includes: how are you sleeping? What's your exercise schedule? What do you eat? How do those foods make you feel? And I might have to take a break to get water. And so we talk about all of those things, and then we also discuss a few tenets of healthcare science. For example, if you're having a lot of sugar, carbs, or protein before you study, you're actually increasing your insulin, and insulin decreases your cognition. And so you might feel slow or groggy while you're trying to prep, and it could be due to your food. A lot of people have intolerances that they're not aware of. So we talk about that, and how can you suss those out and minimize the impact that they have on your study and your overall health. Sleep is another important one. We know from psychology, we know from neuroscience that in the consolidation of information from intermediate to long-term memory takes place over about 4 nights of REM sleep for the average person. If you're not sleeping right, meaning if you have disturbed sleep, if you are not getting enough sleep, or actually if you're getting too much sleep, that could be potentiating a phenotype of anxiety for you. It could also be decreasing your ability to perform cognitive tasks at long stretches like the MCAT. It could diminish focus. And then exercise is something that we know promotes neurogenesis. It increases your level of endorphins, which are sort of your endogenous happy chemicals, right? That'll relieve anxiety, make you feel good, and really put you in the right mindset to get the most out of your prep. And the average pre-medical student, let's be honest, doesn't do a very good job of those. On average, we are emaciated, out of shape, we don't sleep well, we don't eat well, that's for sure. I mean, there is very little scientific justification for calling some of the things that we eat food. And as a matter of fact, oftentimes, students are getting sick all the time. When I was an undergraduate, I was getting sick way too often. I had bronchitis, sometimes 2 times a year or more. And I thought that was normal. It's not normal. So these are considerations you have to have. If you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling depressed, get counseling. If you are feeling unwell, tired, lethargic, go to a nutritionist or a dietitian, a licensed dietitian, or talk to your physician if you trust them, and hopefully you have a physician you trust, and work through some of these wellness behaviors. You can even talk to me. I'm not licensed in anything, but I did teach, Taekwondo for, the last decade, and, part of that is working with people on their health, their wellness, and making sure that their body, mind, and spirit are in line to produce a state of well-being that's conducive to success. Now, I ended with those wellness behaviors because a lot of the time people zone out when I start with that, but that is the most important thing. If there is anything that I have seen in the majority of cases, almost every single student I have, when we can improve their wellness behaviors, the test scores go up, the level of thought goes up, the anxiety goes down. And so rather than banging your head against the wall, it's sort of like without those wellness behaviors, you're trying to get to your goal. It's like trying to drive a car from North Carolina to California without oil. Is it possible? I mean, maybe on a very low tank of oil or something like that. Maybe you'll make it, but the engine's going to be destroyed by the time you get there. It's going to be a very difficult drive. You'll probably break down a bunch. Imagine if you just put oil in the car. And that's what the average pre-medical, medical student does. That's what the average doctor does that I've seen, to be honest, is you burn yourself out. The students who go into this field are so gifted, so talented, so brilliant that they can make it from North Carolina to California without any oil, and they get there. And people use that as an example. Well, my friend goes to UT Southwestern, my friend goes to whatever school, and he did this. Well, imagine how much better he would have done, how much happier he would have been, how much easier it would have been if he took care of his own physical, mental, and spiritual health, if he took time to spend time with family, if he took time to make money, if he made time to cook for himself and to do things that give life meaning and peace and happiness, right? There is no reason to live the life of an extremist, to live a life where we neglect ourselves, where we neglect the things that make life enjoyable and livable and happy and healthy and sustainable. Think 30 years into the future and think about what you have to do today to be there 30 years in the future, to not be depressed in 30 years, to not be burnt out in 30 years, to not be cynical in 30 years. You have to be authentic to yourself, and you have to take the time to take care of yourself. And it includes during times of high stress, like the medical school admissions process, like med school, like MCAT prep, like USMLE prep. There is no time, there is no period of life where there is any reason to be neglectful of our own health. It is never constructive. Never. So I could go on about that for hours, but I want to keep this video under an hour. So I hope that was beneficial. I do apologize for any errors in my speech or failures to communicate. And so I implore you, please reach out with whatever questions you have in the chat or in the comment section, or reach out to me personally via email or phone, whatever method you have of contacting me. I'm always happy I'm determined to clarify failures in my teaching. But additionally, I know many of us are going through difficulties, not just academic, but personally. And so if I can ever be of service, whenever I can be of service, please reach out. Please reach out. Okay, and we can talk about it and see what can be done to get you to a happier place. Thank you so much for your time. Have a beautiful day. I hope to hear from you.